Today, my restaurant closes earlier than usual. At 7 o'clock in the evening, I let the last waiter go and am alone in the empty room. This time belongs to me alone. A few hours of silence amid polished tables and dim lights. I feel more at home here than in my apartment on 13th Avenue. I'm 73 years old, and the only thing I really have is a place. My name is Hubert Fulton. To most visitors, I'm just Mr. Hugh, the owner of the North Star, one of the coziest restaurants in West Fargo. Not the most expensive, not the trendiest, but mine. I sit down at a corner table that overlooks the entire panorama of the room and pour myself a glass of red wine. Oak, blackberry, a touch of vanilla. I've always been able to distinguish the nuances of flavors. That skill saved me once, but more on that later. The restaurant business was never my dream. Until I was 52, I worked as an accountant for a small farm equipment firm. Stable job, boring life, unhappy marriage, just like many people. Varen and I were together for almost 30 years. We met at a party at a mutual friend's house, married 6 months later, and Tobias was born a year later. Our only son. I take a sip of wine and look at the picture on the wall. A small restaurant, opening day, me cutting the red ribbon. That was 18 years ago. 18 years after my life fell apart and then, unexpectedly, found a new direction. The divorce wasn't pretty, like most divorces after years of marriage. Varen found someone else, Christopher, an investment banker who often stayed in West Fargo on business. I don't blame her. Our marriage had long ago become routine. We slept in separate rooms, talked only about household matters and bills. The only thing that kept us together was Tobias, who was 23 at the time. When Varen announced she was leaving, I felt more relief than pain. But what followed was a real blow. Tobias chose his mother's side. Completely, no hesitation. It was as if he'd been waiting for an opportunity to cut ties with me. "You were never a real father," he told me before he packed up his things and left with Varen for Minnesota, where Christopher had invited her. "You were just a man who lived with us and paid the bills." Maybe he was right. I never knew how to express my feelings. I never knew what to talk to my son about other than his studies and future career. I didn't go to his baseball games because I was working late. I didn't help him with his homework because Varen did it better. I loved my son, but I guess I forgot to tell him that. After they left, I was alone in an empty house with a mortgage and no desire to continue working as an accountant. Something in me had broken, or perhaps something was finally freeing up. Within a month, I quit my job, sold the house, and decided to try something that had always been my secret passion: cooking. I've always loved to cook. When I was young, I even considered chef school, but my parents insisted on a serious education. Now that I had nothing to lose, I enrolled in a cooking class at a local college. I was 53 years old and the oldest student in the group. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, but I didn't care. For 2 years, I worked as a cook's helper in various West Fargo restaurants, saving every penny and looking for a place to run my own business. When I finally found a small space in an old building on Main Street, I only had enough savings for the initial renovations and equipment. I had to borrow the rest. The bank hesitated for a long time before approving a loan for an older man with no experience in the restaurant business. But my business plan was impeccable. Years of work as an accountant had taken their toll. North Star opened on a cold October day in 2006. The first few months were a real challenge. I worked 18 hours a day, buying groceries at dawn, cooking, serving visitors, and at night I did the bookkeeping. Several times I was on the verge of bankruptcy, but gradually the restaurant began to acquire regular customers. People came for my specialties: wild duck stew with cranberry sauce, bison steak with caramelized vegetables, homemade bread with butter and thyme. 3 years later, the North Star was already considered one of the best restaurants in town. I expanded the space, hired professional chefs and waiters, but continued to personally oversee every detail. The restaurant became my life, my child, my salvation. Over the years, I tried several times to contact Tobias, sent letters, cards for Christmas and his birthday, called when I had his number. Sometimes he would answer, briefly, dryly, more out of politeness than interest. He graduated from college, earned a degree in finance, and started working for an investment firm in St. Paul. In his words, he was building a career and didn't have time for sentimentality. Our last meeting was 5 years ago when he came to West Fargo on business. He agreed to have coffee with me, 30 minutes between business meetings. We sat in a coffee shop not far from my restaurant. I didn't invite him to the North Star. For some reason, I didn't want to show him what had become the center of my life. "How's your mother?" I asked, even though Varen and I hadn't spoken in a long time. Fine," Tobias answered, glancing at his watch. "She and Christopher bought a house in Florida, and they spend their winters there. And you? Do you have someone special?" He shrugged. I work. I work a lot. Not much time for a personal life." He was similar to me in appearance. The same dark eyes, the same chin line. But otherwise, we were strangers to each other. I didn't know what he liked, what he was into, what he dreamed about. 30 minutes passed in awkward pauses and empty phrases. When he left, I was relieved. After that meeting, our communication was reduced to rare phone calls on holidays. He never asked about my life, and I stopped telling. Why? He wasn't interested in the fact that his father had gone from being an accountant to a successful restaurateur, that I had friends, that I had hobbies, that I had started traveling, that I was finally living, not existing. Taking another sip of wine, I get up and go into the kitchen. Here, among the pots and pans polished to a shine, I feel truly happy. I open the refrigerator and pull out the leftover duck pâté and a slice of baguette. Dinner alone is something I've long since gotten used to. The news of Tobias's marriage took me by surprise. I didn't hear it from him, of course not, but from Hank Dorsey, my wine supplier. Hank was at a wine conference in Minneapolis and happened to meet a group of financiers, including my son. I introduced myself, said I supply wines for your restaurant. Hank told me, sitting behind the bar at the North Star. He seemed surprised, but quickly pulled himself together. He introduced me to his fiancée, a beautiful girl, by the way. Pearl, I think, said the wedding was next month. I congratulated him and asked if you'd be at the wedding. He gave me a weird look and said you'd probably be too busy. I felt something tighten in my chest. My son is getting married and I find out about it by accident, from a stranger. He didn't even see fit to invite me or even let me know. "Do you know anything about his fiancée?" I asked, trying not to show how hurt I was. Hank shook his head. "Only that she's from some rich family. The Addingtons, if I'm not mistaken. I think her father owns a hotel chain or something." I nodded and poured us each another glass of wine. We talked about the new shipment of Bordeaux, the upcoming wine festival, everything but my son and his upcoming wedding. When Hank left, I sat alone in the empty restaurant for a long time. Why had Tobias kept such an important event in his life from me? Was his resentment so deep, or was it something else? Maybe he was ashamed of me in front of his fiancée and her parents. A former accountant who owned a small restaurant in a provincial town, not the most impressive father for a man who apparently aspired to enter the upper class. I pulled out my phone and looked at Tobias's contact. The last time we'd spoken was on Christmas Day, a brief, formal conversation. I almost pressed the call button but stopped. What am I going to tell him? That I know about his wedding from a stranger? That I was hurt by his silence? No, that would only make things worse. Instead, I sent a short message. "Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. Be happy." He didn't reply. Over the next few days, I tried to find out more about the Addington family. It turned out that they actually owned a chain of boutique hotels in the Midwest. Edmund Addington was a respected businessman, and his wife Rosalind was involved in philanthropy. Their daughter Pearl had graduated from a prestigious college with a degree in art history. I tried to imagine how Tobias would fit into this family. My son had always sought recognition, status. Perhaps Pearl Addington and her family were not only a love for him, but a way for him to climb the social ladder. The wedding took place in mid-June. I learned about it from a short article in the society section of the local newspaper. There was a picture of Tobias in a tuxedo and Pearl in an elegant white dress. They looked happy. I cut out the note and put it in a desk drawer in my office. That afternoon, I closed the restaurant earlier than usual and went home. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my loneliness. I had a successful business, respect in the city, a few close friends. But on the most important day in my only son's life, I wasn't invited. I was a stranger. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I thought about how things might have turned out differently if I had been a different father. If I had talked to Tobias more, taken more interest in his life, shown my love more, if I hadn't let resentment and pride come between us after the divorce. In the morning, I made a decision. I had to try again. I couldn't change the past, but maybe I could build at least some semblance of a relationship in the future. My son had gotten married and had a new life. Maybe this was a chance for us to start over too. It was 2 weeks after Tobias's wedding before I plucked up the courage to call him. It was a Sunday, the restaurant was closed, and I was sitting on the balcony of my apartment watching the neighborhood kids play in the courtyard. The phone lay in front of me like a silent reproach. I had been putting off this call for far too long. Dialing the number, I took a deep breath. The beeps came one after another, and I almost thought he wasn't going to answer when a familiar voice came through. "Hello." Tobias sounded surprised, as if he hadn't expected to see my number on the screen of his phone. "Hello, Tobias." "It's Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice as casual as possible. "How are you?" There was a short pause. I could almost see him frowning, trying to figure out why I'd called. "I'm fine," he finally answered. "A lot of work. I wanted to congratulate you on your marriage," I continued. "I hope you and Pearl are happy." "Thank you," he replied dryly. "We're fine." The conversation didn't go well. Every word was difficult, as if we were speaking different languages through a bad translator. "I'd like to meet your wife," I said, turning to the main purpose of the call. "Maybe you could come to West Fargo for the weekend. I could cook dinner." "Now's not a good time," Tobias interrupted me. "We have a lot to do after the wedding. Besides, I'm busy at work." "Of course I understand," I said, swallowing my disappointment. "Maybe in a month? Or I could come to your place." "I don't think that's a good idea." His voice got harder. "Look, Dad, I appreciate the call, but I've got to go. We have company." And he hung up before I could say anything back. I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling like I'd been kicked in the butt. That was it, our whole conversation. Not a word about why he hadn't invited me to the wedding. Not a single question about my life. Nothing but a polite refusal and a hurried goodbye. I put the phone away and went back into the apartment. There was a newspaper on the table with a note about the wedding that I had cut out. I looked again at the picture of my son and his wife. They looked like the perfect couple. Young, beautiful, successful. What could an old man from a country town add to their lives? I made my next attempt 3 weeks later. This time I called on a weekday during my lunch break. Tobias answered after the fifth ring, and I could tell from the background noise that he was in a restaurant or cafe. "Dad? What's wrong?" There was concern in his voice. "Nothing's wrong," I hastened to reassure him. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." He sighed, and I could imagine him rolling his eyes. "I'm fine, working." "How's Pearl?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Are you settled in from your honeymoon?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he answered briefly. "Look, I'm at a business lunch right now, so I can't talk long." "Of course I understand." I tried not to show my disappointment. "Maybe we could talk at a more convenient time. I'd like to hear about your new family." "Dad," Tobias interrupted me, "I'm very busy right now. New project, important clients. Let's call later, okay?" "Okay," I agreed. "What time would be convenient for you?" "I'll call," he said, but we both knew that wasn't going to happen. "I gotta go, bye." Again the short beeps. I hung up feeling bitter and resentful. My son didn't want to talk to me for even a few minutes. What had I done to deserve this attitude? Was divorcing his mother such an unforgivable sin? I knew I had to leave him alone. Let him live his life. But something inside me wouldn't let me give up. Perhaps it was senile sentimentality, or the thought that life is finite, and one day it would be too late to right a wrong. Over the next 2 months, I called Tobias several more times. Each conversation was short and awkward. He was always too busy, always call back later. I tried to find out about his life, about his work, about Pearl, but all I got were one-word answers and promises to talk another time. One day, after a particularly short and cold conversation, I decided to look up information about the Addington family on the internet. I'm not particularly friendly with computers, but over the years of running a business, I've learned how to find the information I need. The Addingtons turned out to be even more influential than I realized. Edmund Addington was more than just a hotel chain owner. He was on the board of directors of several major companies, was active in state politics, and had connections in the highest business circles. His wife Rosalind headed a charitable foundation supporting educational programs for gifted children. Pearl was their only daughter, a graduate of a prestigious university. Judging from photos on social media, she was involved in the arts and organizing charity events. In one of the photos, she was standing next to Tobias at some formal reception, both of them in evening gowns, with glasses of champagne surrounded by elegant people. I stared at that picture for a long time. My son looked like a different person, confident, successful, belonging to a world I knew only from movies and newspapers. No wonder he didn't want to introduce his new family to his small-town restaurateur father. The thought hurt, but I couldn't push it away. Tobias was ashamed of me, ashamed of my humble business, my background, my simplicity. For a man who had built a career in the world of finance and was trying to enter high society through marriage to the daughter of a powerful businessman, I was an uncomfortable reminder of his less than brilliant past. For the next few weeks, I immersed myself in my work, trying not to think about my son. The restaurant required constant attention, a new menu for the fall season, replacing some of the equipment, training new staff. It helped distract me from thoughts of a broken relationship with his only child. But one evening, as I was closing the restaurant after a long day, I got a call from an old friend, Norman Barkley. We had met a few years ago when he came to West Fargo on business and happened to wander into the North Star. Since then, he's been a regular customer and friend whenever he's in town. "Hugh, my friend," his loud voice filled the receiver. "How are you doing? I'll be in West Fargo this Friday. Make a reservation for me." "Norman," I was genuinely excited by his call. "Sure, I'll have a table waiting for you. The usual for two." "This time for four," he answered. "I'm coming with business associates. By the way, you won't believe who I just met in Chicago." "Your son," I froze, clutching my phone. "Tobias? Where?" "At a financial conference. He was representing his company. Smart guy, he'll go far. He was with his wife, very nice girl, and her parents, big shots, I gather." "Did you, talk to him?" I asked, not knowing if I wanted to hear the answer. "Of course I have. I've known him since he was a kid. Remember when we went fishing when he was about 10 years old?" Norman laughed. "I told him I was a regular at your restaurant and that you make the best steak in the state. Do you know what he replied?" I was silent, waiting for him to continue. "He said he was glad you were doing well, but that you didn't see each other much." And then he quickly changed the subject. It was a little weird, to be honest. I pressed my lips together, feeling the bitterness rising inside. "Yeah, we haven't been very close lately." "I'm sorry to hear that." Norman sounded sympathetic. "He seems like a successful young man. His father-in-law seems to be helping him with his career. They obviously have a close relationship." After that conversation, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The image of Tobias, his wife, and her parents kept coming back to me. They were family, the kind of family I wasn't a part of and probably never will be. In the morning, I made a decision. One more try, one last one. I wanted to have an honest conversation with my son, to offer to meet, to get to know his new family. If he said no again, I'd leave him alone. I called Tobias at lunchtime. To my surprise, he answered almost immediately. "Dad, is something wrong?" There was worry in his voice again. "No, nothing's wrong," I said. "I just wanted to talk." "A real talk, Tobias." A short pause. I could hear his breathing in the receiver. "I don't have time for long conversations right now." "I know," I interrupted him. "You're always busy, but I just need a few minutes." He sighed. "Okay, go ahead." I took a deep breath and began. "Tobias, I know our relationship is complicated. I wasn't the perfect father, and after your mom and I divorced, we barely spoke to each other. I'm as much to blame for that as you are. But you're my only son, and I'd like to try to fix what can still be fixed." "Dad," he started, but I wouldn't let him finish. "Sonali, let me finish, please. You got married, you have a new family. I'd like to meet them. Pearl, her parents. Perhaps over dinner. Anytime that's convenient for you." There was silence. So long I thought I'd lost the connection. "Tobias? Are you here?" "Yes," he finally answered. His voice grew colder. "Look, I appreciate your, desire to mend fences. But now is not a good time. Maybe later." "When, Tobias?" I felt my patience wearing thin. "When is the best time? A year from now? 5 years from now? When I'm no longer alive?" "Don't be dramatic," he said dryly. "It's just not the right time. I'm just starting to build a relationship with the Pearl family, and it's very important to my career. Your career? I interjected. Not for your happiness or your love, but for your career? Acham, you don't understand. There was irritation in his voice. Edmund Addington can open doors for me that I've only dreamed of before. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance. And can I interfere with that chance? I asked quietly. By my presence? He didn't answer right away, and that silence said more than any words could. It's not that, he said at last, but we both knew it was a lie. Then what is it? I insisted. Cyril, why don't you want me to meet your new family? Because, he hesitated, as if searching for words. Because we have different worlds, Dad. Different social circles. Different ideas about life. And you're ashamed of me? It wasn't a question. It was a statement. I'm not ashamed, he answered quickly, too quickly. I just think some people are better off not crossing paths. His words hit me harder than any physical blow. I felt something inside me finally break. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But you know, Tobias, I think you're wrong. I think it would be worth it for your wife and her parents to meet your father, whatever he is, for you, for the sake of understanding who you are and where you came from. No, his voice became harsh. No, you'll embarrass me at dinner with my wife's parents. Stay home. I was so stunned by these words that I was speechless for a moment. Disgrace you? I finally squeezed out. By what, Tobias? By being a simple man? That I don't wear expensive suits and talk about stocks and bonds? That I own a restaurant and not a hotel chain? You don't understand, he repeated. The Addingtons. They're from another world. They expect a certain level, certain manners, certain backgrounds. And you lie to them about me? I asked, feeling anger rising inside. Who am I in your stories, Tobias? A beggar? A drunkard? A loser? I have to go, he said instead of answering. I have a meeting. Of course you do, I grinned bitterly. You always have better things to do than talk to your father. Goodbye, Dad, he said and hung up. I stood there with the phone in my hand, feeling devastated and broken. My son was so ashamed of me that he refused to even introduce me to his new family. What had I done to deserve such contempt? I wasn't a perfect father, but I loved him, cared for him, provided for him. I never cheated, I never stole, I never betrayed. I was just an ordinary man who did the best I could. That night I worked in the restaurant like an automaton, mechanically performing the usual actions, greeting guests, checking the kitchen, supervising the staff. But a storm of emotions was raging inside me. Resentment, anger, frustration, bitterness. Around 9 p.m., Vincent, my maitre d', came up to me. Mr. Fulton, we have a reservation for next Friday, a table for 4 at 8 p.m., he said, looking at his notes. Under the name of Addington Fulton. Isn't that a relative of yours by any chance? I froze when I heard those names together. Say that again, please, I asked, not believing my ears. Addington Fulton, Vincent repeated. The reservation was made this morning through our website. Phone number and email for confirmation. I took the tablet from him and looked at the record. It was indeed Addington Fulton, 4 people, 8 p.m. Friday. In the contact column was a phone number I didn't recognize and an email with Pearl's name on it. Everything okay, boss? Vincent asked, noticing my confusion. Yeah, I answered, trying to make my voice sound normal. Everything's fine. Confirm the reservation, please. Check the table by the window overlooking the garden. When Vincent left, I sat at the bar, trying to make sense of the situation. Tobias, who had just flatly refused to introduce me to his new family, was going to bring them to my restaurant. The North Star, owned by his father. The same father who could supposedly embarrass him in front of his father-in-law and mother-in-law. Either it was an incredible coincidence, or my son had no idea that the restaurant the Addingtons were probably talking about or recommended by their acquaintances belonged to me. A sudden thought struck me. What if Tobias really didn't know? What if, in all these years, he had never once inquired into my life enough to find out what I was doing? What if he still thought of me as the same accountant who lived from paycheck to paycheck and struggled to make ends meet after the divorce? The thought was both painful and strangely liberating. If Tobias really didn't know about my business, about what I'd accomplished over the years, then his reluctance to introduce me to the Addingtons might have a very different reason than I'd realized. Not because I wasn't rich enough or successful enough for their circle. It was because he genuinely thought I was a failure, a man with no accomplishments or prospects, someone who could only tarnish his image in the eyes of his new family. And now they were going to come to my restaurant, to book a table in an establishment that I had built from scratch, that I was proud of, that had become the purpose and meaning of my life after my divorce. What should I have done? Cancel the reservation on some pretext? Pretend to be sick that night and not show up at the restaurant? Or a sudden thought occurred to me, a thought that made me smile for the first time in this long, hard day. What if I was just there? What if I greeted the guests personally, like I do with all the important clients? What if Tobias and his new family knew the truth, not from my words, but by seeing it with their own eyes? The week before, the scheduled dinner passed in agonizing doubt. Every day I woke up with the determination to carry out my plan, but by evening my resolve had melted away, replaced by doubt. Should I do this to my son? Wouldn't it look like petty revenge? Wouldn't it make the chasm between us even deeper? But then I remembered his words. No, you'll embarrass me at dinner with my wife's parents. Stay home. And my resolve returned. Who gave him the right to judge me without even knowing who I had become, what I had achieved? Who gave him the right to be ashamed of me without seeing me for years? On Thursday, the day before the scheduled dinner, I double-checked the reservation, a table for four by the window overlooking a small garden. No special requests, but I've ordered the finest wines from our collection. If we're going to put on a show, we're going to put on a show. That evening, I stood for a long time in front of the mirror in my apartment, looking at my reflection. The gray hair, the wrinkles around my eyes, the heavy hands. Yes, I looked my 73 years old, but I wasn't the loser my son had apparently described to his new family. Friday morning was overcast and cool. A light rain drummed on the windows as I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. It was going to be a big day, and I wanted to make sure everything was ready, not only for my son's family, but for the rest of the guests as well. The first thing I did was check out the kitchen. Chef Raymond was already in place, preparing preparations for the evening. Mr. Fulton, he nodded at me, still chopping vegetables. You're early tonight. Big night, Ray, I replied, looking around at the spotlessly clean work surfaces. We're going to have some special guests. The critic? He raised an eyebrow. Or a celebrity? I shook my head. My son, with his wife and her parents. Raymond froze with the knife in his hand. He'd worked at the North Star for almost 10 years and knew about my complicated relationship with Tobias. That's how it is, he said in a neutral tone. So you two are finally on good terms? So, not exactly, I didn't go into details. I just want it to be perfect. It will be, he promised. I'll personally oversee every meal. The rest of the day passed in the usual routine. I checked the accounts, discussed the new wine shipment with the sommelier, and met with the supplier of fresh vegetables. All the while, a tension grew in the back of my mind. I tried to imagine how the evening would go, how Tobias and his companions would look when I approached their table. By 6 p.m., the restaurant began to fill with its first customers. Friday was always a busy day, and by 7 o'clock, almost every table was occupied. I was standing at the entrance, greeting the guests, when Vincent said quietly, "The Addington Fulton table has confirmed the reservation. They'll be in at 8, as planned." I nodded, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. It was an hour to meet my son in his new family. By 7:30, I'd changed into my best suit, a navy blue suit with a barely there stripe and an off-white shirt. I tied on my favorite burgundy wine tie, a gift from the staff for my 70th birthday. Looked at myself in the office mirror and took a deep breath. I looked decent, not like a millionaire or an aristocrat, but like a man who knew his worth and was proud of what he'd achieved. At exactly 8 o'clock, Vincent came up to me. "They're here, Mr. Fulton, your son's family." I nodded. "Show them to the table. I'll watch from the kitchen." This was not part of our normal routine. I usually greeted important guests personally, but today I wanted to see them first, to observe from the outside. From the ajar kitchen door, I could see the table by the window. Vincent led 4 men through the hall. Tobias was first, in an immaculate dark suit, his hair perfectly styled. Next to him was a young woman with auburn hair in an elegant bun. Pearl. They were followed by a middle-aged couple, a tall man with gray on his temples and a slender woman in a dark green dress. They sat down at a table, and Vincent handed them menus. I saw Tobias smiling, saying something, helping Pearl with her napkin. He seemed confident, calm, pleased with himself, not at all like the man I knew. The sommelier came over and offered wine. I heard Tobias choose one of the more expensive ones on our list. Not a bad choice, son, I thought, but I've got something better in store for you. I gave them time to settle in, order appetizers, start a conversation. Then I cautiously stepped out of the kitchen and took up a position behind the column, close enough to hear their conversation, but far enough away to remain unnoticed. A really impressive place, said the man I identified as Edmund Addington. I heard about it from Jeffrey Pearson. He said they make an excellent buffalo steak here. I ordered it for you, sir, Tobias said, and I heard a note in his voice that I didn't know he had, a suave, almost ingratiating tone. I'm sure you'll like it. Tobias always knows the best places, said the woman. Rosalind Addington. Last time he was in Chicago, he found such a charming Italian restaurant. What was it called, dear? Primavera, Tobias answered. The chef used to work there in Milan. Tobias has excellent taste, Edmund said, sipping his wine, and business acumen. I was impressed with his proposals for reorganizing the investment portfolio of our Eastern chain. Dad, Pearl said softly, we agreed not to talk about work today. Of course, dear, Edmund nodded. I just wanted to say that your choice of husband does us honor. Not every young man could have climbed the career ladder so quickly, starting from scratch. Tobias smiled modestly. It's all thanks to hard work, and of course, Pearl's support. And your education, Rosalind added. The economics department at the University of Minnesota is a serious school. I felt a wave of bitterness rising inside me. I remembered saving money to pay for Tobias's college education, working overtime to put money aside for his education, and now he was sitting here, accepting compliments as if he'd accomplished everything on his own, with no help from anyone. By the way, Pearl said, turning to her husband, you haven't talked about your father in a long time. How's he doing? I froze, listening. This was the moment of truth. Tobias frowned slightly. Not very well, I'm afraid. You know, after he divorced my mother, he couldn't find himself. He's still working at the same accounting job, barely making ends meet. I felt the blood rush to my face. So that's the story he told about his father? A poor loser stuck in the same job, unable to move on? That's so sad, Rosalind said sympathetically. At his age, there should be financial stability. Unfortunately, he's never been good with money, Tobias continued, shaking his wine glass. And his temper is complicated. He was always a loner, didn't get along well with people. Every word was like a whip. I stood there, fists clenched, unable to believe what I was hearing. My own son wasn't just ashamed of me. He'd made up a whole story about my failed life in order to… What? To look more impressive against the loser dad background? Did you offer to help him? Edmund asked, and I could hear the genuine concern in his voice. Tobias shook his head sadly. Many times, but he's too proud to accept it. He prefers to handle things on his own, though. He paused dramatically, not very successfully. Perhaps we could help, Rosalind suggested. Edmund has connections in accounting firms. Maybe there's a better place. I appreciate your kindness, Tobias replied, but I'm afraid it's no use. Well, let's just say he's not one to accept change. He prefers to live in the past. It's a pity we can't meet him, Pearl said. I'm sure he's an interesting man, in spite of his difficulties. Believe me, Tobias squeezed her hand lightly. It's not a good idea. He doesn't fit in very well with the company. Besides, usually by late afternoon, he's already not in the best shape. I see what he was implying, that I drink. Me, who in my entire life never been drunk more than 3 or 4 times in my entire life. Edmund nodded understandingly. Alcohol is the bane of many single men of his generation. It's sad. Chickadee, yes, Tobias sighed. But I try not to judge him. After all, everyone has their own path. You're a good son, Rosalind said warmly. A lot of people would have just turned away. I stood there, unable to believe my ears. A good son? Tobias, who hadn't spoken to me in years, who was ashamed of me, who had made up these pathetic lies about my life. A good son. At that moment, the waiter came over with the first courses. I took advantage of the pause to go back into the kitchen and catch my breath. I was shaking with anger and resentment. How could he? How could my own son lie about me like that? Use me as a pathetic backdrop for his made-up image? Mr. Fulton? Raymond looked at me with concern. Are you all right? I shook my head. No, Ray, I'm not okay at all, but I will be soon. Is there something wrong with the guests? He asked, nodding toward the hall. Everything's wrong, I answered, but I'll fix it. Are the hot dishes ready for table 7? In 10 minutes, he answered. Good, I took a deep breath. I'll serve them myself. Raymond raised his eyebrows in surprise but said nothing. I rarely serve tables personally, only on special occasions. I spent the next 10 minutes gathering my thoughts and calming down. Anger was giving way to cold determination. I wasn't going to make a scene or cause a scandal. I just wanted to restore the truth, to show the Addingtons that reality was nothing like my son had described it. When the hot dishes were ready, I helped the waiters place them on the serving cart and wheeled it to table 7. As I approached them, I could feel my heart beating faster and faster, but I remained outwardly calm. I approached the table with a professional smile. Good evening. Your main courses. Tobias looked up from his wine glass and froze. His face paled as rapidly as if he had seen a ghost. Pearl looked at me curiously, then at her husband, noticing his reaction. Is something wrong, darling? She asked. Tobias opened his mouth but couldn't get a word out. I took advantage of the moment and began setting out the dishes. Not sure so. Buffalo steak with caramelized vegetables for you, sir, I said, setting the plate in front of Edmund. Duck breast with orange sauce for Madam. This is for Rosalind. Grilled salmon with fennel for the lovely lady. I smiled at Pearl. And finally, lamb with rosemary and garlic for... I looked directly into Tobias's eyes. For my son. There was silence. A deep, ringing silence in which even the air seemed to freeze. Pearl shifted her gaze from Tobias to me, her eyes widening in surprise. Rosalind pressed her palm to her lips. Edmund straightened, watching intently. Your son? Pearl said at last, her voice trembling. I smiled, trying to make it look sincere, not gloating. Yes, Tobias is my son, and I'm the loser father he's probably told you about. Tobias finally regained his speech. Dad, how did you... I didn't let him finish. How did I end up here? Very simple. This is my restaurant. I've owned the North Star for the last 18 years. Tobias's face turned even paler, if that was even possible. He looked like he was going to throw up. Your restaurant? He mumbled. I nodded. Yes, I opened it after I divorced your mom. Remember when you said I couldn't find myself? Well, it turns out I did find myself after all. Edmund Addington cleared his throat. I think we should introduce ourselves. I'm Edmund Addington, Father Pearl. Hubert Fulton. I shook his outstretched hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Likewise, he replied, glancing quickly at Tobias. I must say, your restaurant has gotten excellent recommendations from my business associates. Thank you, I nodded. We do our best. Pearl was still staring at me wide-eyed. So you're the owner of this restaurant, not an accountant with financial problems? I shook my head. I was an accountant years ago, but after my divorce, I decided to make a drastic change in my life. I've always loved cooking, so I opened a restaurant. Financial problems. Well, they happened in the early years, but for the last 15 years, things had been going pretty well. Tobias stared at his plate without looking up. His shoulders were tense, his fists clenched. Rosalind Addington finally broke the awkward pause. Mr. Fulton, perhaps you'd like to join us. I think we all have something to talk about. I thought for a moment. My original plan had been to simply reveal the truth and walk away, leaving Tobias to explain himself. But Rosalind's invitation had been sincere, and I really wanted to get to know them better. I'd love to, I replied, but I'm afraid I have a lot to do in the kitchen. Perhaps after dinner? Of course, Edmund nodded. We'll be waiting for you. I turned to leave but stopped and looked at them again. By the way, um, I deliberately pause, savoring the moment. How do you like the food in my restaurant? Tobias flinched as if from a blow. Pearl smiled uncertainly. Everything looks delicious, Mr. Fulton. I'm sure we'll love it. I hope so, I bowed slightly. Enjoy your meal. I turned and walked away, feeling the eyes of all four of them on me. There were muffled voices in the back of my head. It sounded like Pearl was saying something angry to Tobias. I didn't turn around. My mission was accomplished. In the kitchen, I leaned against the wall, feeling my knees shake. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a strange emptiness. I'd done what I'd planned, revealed the truth, showed Tobias and his new family that reality didn't match the pathetic story he'd made up about me. But I felt no victory, only bitterness and fatigue. After I left, I didn't return to the gym for about half an hour. I needed time to gather my thoughts, to calm down, to decide what to do next. On the one hand, I'd gotten what I wanted. I'd shown Tobias and his new family that I wasn't the loser he thought I was. On the other hand, I felt no joy or satisfaction from this little revenge. Only emptiness and bitterness. As I busied myself in the kitchen, I peered at the table through the small window in the door. Tobias looked like he was on pins and needles. He barely touched his food, talking and gesticulating as if trying to explain the situation. Pearl seemed restrained and frustrated. She nodded occasionally, but mostly just stared at her plate. Edmund and Rosalind were more relaxed. They ate, occasionally exchanging short remarks. Finally, when the main courses were finished and the waiter cleared away the plates, I decided it was time to go back. I had to finish what I started, no matter how hard it was. As I approached the table, I noticed Tobias's shoulders tense. He saw me out of the corner of his eye and stiffened. Pearl straightened, her face aloof but polite. Edmund, on the other hand, smiled and even stood up to greet me. "Ah, Mr. Fulton," he said. "We were just talking about your restaurant. I must say the food is excellent, especially the buffalo steak." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," I said, stopping at a vacant chair. "May I join you?" "Of course," Edmund gestured to a chair. "I've been meaning to ask you about how you started the business." I sat down, trying not to look at Tobias. My son sat with his fists clenched under the table, his face a mask of cold politeness, but his eyes a storm of emotion. "It's a long story," I said, accepting the cup of coffee the waiter had brought. "We have time," Rosalind smiled softly. "Besides, this is a family reunion, isn't it? Albeit somewhat unusual." "Yes, it is." I couldn't help the irony in my voice. "And considering that until tonight I hadn't even realized that my son was planning to bring his new family to my restaurant." Tobias finally spoke, his voice strained. "I didn't know it was your restaurant, Dad. One of Edmund's co-workers recommended the North Star." "Yeah?" I had no idea. "Obviously," I looked him straight in the eye. "Otherwise you'd have chosen somewhere else, right?" He didn't answer, but his cheeks flashed red. Pearl put her hand on his shoulder, either supporting or restraining him. "Mr. Fulton," she interjected, "Tobias and I have just been married, and I've been anxious to meet his whole family. He said you were busy and couldn't make it to the wedding." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? That's strange. I didn't even get an invitation." Pearl turned to her husband, a look of bewilderment in her eyes. "Tobias? You told me you sent the invitation." "I was going to," he answered quickly, avoiding her gaze. "But then I decided that Papa wouldn't feel comfortable with so many strangers. He always preferred quiet family gatherings." I felt the wave of anger rising inside again. Another lie. Another attempt to make me look bad. "How thoughtful of you," I said, not hiding my sarcasm. "Though I don't remember you taking much interest in my preferences in recent years." Edmund cleared his throat, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "Mr. Fulton, I hear you've opened a restaurant after a long career as an accountant. That's an impressive change. What made you decide to do that?" "Mr. Fulton, I was grateful for the change of subject. Talking about the restaurant was much easier than continuing a painful conversation with my son. After my divorce, I realized it was time to make a change in my life," I answered. "I've always loved cooking, so I decided to try my hand at the restaurant business. Of course, it was difficult without experience, but I think my accounting skills helped. At least I always knew how much we were spending and earning." Edmund laughed. That's an important advantage. Many restaurants go bankrupt because of poor financial planning. I'm quite right, I nodded. The first 2 years were particularly difficult. I was on the verge of bankruptcy several times. But then things picked up. We found our niche, simple but quality food made from local produce. It shows. Rosalind raised her wine glass. It's a beautiful place, cozy, with character, not like those faceless chain restaurants. Thank you, I smiled at her. We try to create a special atmosphere. Tobias sat as if on hot coals. He barely touched his glass, avoided looking at me, and there was an expression on his face that I couldn't read, a mixture of anger, shame, and maybe fear. How many restaurants do you have? Edmund asked, obviously genuinely interested. Only one, I answered. There were offers to open branches in other cities, but I preferred to focus on quality rather than expansion. Besides, I glanced at Tobias unintentionally, I don't have any children to continue the family business. Tobias finally looked at me, and in his gaze I saw pain. For a moment I felt sorry for him, but then I remembered all the things he'd made up about me. All the years of neglect and pity was replaced by cold determination. Interesting, Edmund said, tapping his fingers on the table. You know, I own a chain of boutique hotels in the Midwest. Some of them lack a good restaurant. Perhaps we could discuss a potential partnership. Dad, Pearl interrupted him with a quick glance at Tobias. Maybe this isn't a good time for business negotiations. Edmund glanced at his son-in-law and nodded. Of course, dear. You're right. Mr. Fulton, I beg your pardon. It's a professional habit to look everywhere for business opportunities. That's all right, I smiled. I'm flattered by your interest. Rosalind leaned toward me. Mr. Fulton, I have to ask. Tobias tells me that after the divorce you were all alone. Do you, no partner? No one close to you? I shook my head. No, Mrs. Addington. I didn't remarry. There have been relationships, but nothing serious. The restaurant takes up most of my time and energy. That's a pity, she smiled genuinely. You seem like a very interesting man. Rosalind? Edmund frowned playfully. You're embarrassing our new friend. Not at all, I laughed. Compliments are always nice, especially from such a charming woman. The atmosphere began to lighten a little. Everyone, except Tobias, relaxed and even began to joke. My son, on the other hand, was on pins and needles, looking from me to Pearl as if he were waiting for some kind of disaster. So, Pearl said after a short pause, Tobias said you hadn't spoken to each other in years. Is that true? I nodded. Unfortunately, yes. After his divorce from his mother, our paths parted. Tobias chose his mother's side, which is understandable. She was always closer to him. But why didn't you try to mend the relationship later? She asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. I sighed. I tried, many times, but Tobias was always busy. Career, studying, moving around. That's not quite true, Tobias said at last. His voice sounded strained but firm. You've never really tried to be a part of my life. Even before the divorce, you were always immersed in your work, always distant. Maybe you're right, I admitted. I wasn't the perfect father. Too much work, too little talk about my feelings. That's my fault, and I admit it. But after the divorce, I tried to change. I tried to connect. And you've already given up on me. Because you betrayed us, Tobias exclaimed, and several heads at neighboring tables turned in our direction. He lowered his voice. You betrayed our family when you let Mom go off with someone else. I shook my head. Tobias, you were an adult when your mother and I divorced. You should have realized that our marriage had long since become a formality. We were both unhappy, and I didn't let her go. She made her choice, and so did you. What's that supposed to mean? His eyes narrowed. That you made a choice too, I answered calmly. You chose her side without trying to understand mine. You blame me for everything without asking a single question, and then you ignored my attempts to repair the relationship for years. Tobias opened his mouth to object, but Pearl put her hand on his shoulder. Darling, maybe this isn't the best time for this conversation. She cast an apologetic glance at her parents. We could discuss it later in a more private setting. There's nothing to discuss. Tobias cut her off, pushing her hand away. He set this whole thing up on purpose. Humiliated me in front of you. I shook my head. I didn't set anyone up, Tobias. I didn't know you were coming to my restaurant until I saw the reservation in your name. And as for the humiliation, I paused to collect my thoughts. Didn't you humiliate me by making up a story about a poor, hapless father with an alcohol problem? Tobias turned pale. You overheard our conversation? Not on purpose, I answered, but I heard enough to realize the image you'd created in the eyes of your new family. Edmund cleared his throat. I think we all need to take a deep breath. Family relationships can be difficult, and obviously you both have your resentments and frustrations. But perhaps now is not the best time. No, it's the right time, Tobias interrupted him. His voice was tingling with tension. If he was going to reveal everything, let's not stop halfway. Yes, I didn't tell you the truth about my father. I told you he was poor, that he was a loser. And you know why? Because I was ashamed. Ashamed that my father was a man who didn't even try to fight for his family, who let it fall apart and then ran off to his fantasies about the restaurant business instead of trying to fix it. I felt a wave of anger rising inside, but I forced myself to speak calmly. Tobias, you're distorting the facts. I didn't run away from anything. Your mother chose to leave you for another man, and I respected her choice. What was I supposed to do? Beg her to stay in a marriage that's long dead? Lock her in the house. And as for fantasizing about the restaurant business, you're sitting in that fantasy right now, and it seems quite real. Enough! Tobias jumped up from his seat. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. Come on, Pearl, we're leaving. Pearl looked confused. Tobias, maybe we should... I said we're leaving. He grabbed his coat. I'm sorry, Edmund, Rosalind, but I can't stay here any longer. Pearl cast an apologetic glance at her parents and at me, then stood up and took her coat. Edmund and Rosalind looked at each other, but remained seated. We'll stay a little longer, if Mr. Fulton doesn't mind, Edmund said. Sure should. We have some questions about the restaurant business. Tobias looked at them in disbelief. Are you kidding? Are you staying with him after everything that has happened? Edmund sighed. Tobias, there are obviously a lot of unresolved issues between you and your father. But that doesn't mean we have to be impolite. Mr. Fulton is the owner of this fine restaurant and, more importantly, your father. He deserves respect, even if you don't agree with his life decisions. Fine, Tobias grinned bitterly. Stay. Enjoy each other's company. Pearl, are you coming with me or staying with them? Pearl looked at her husband, then at her parents, clearly torn between her duty to her new family and her unwillingness to be rude. Yeah, I'll go with you, she said finally, but there was no confidence in her voice. But we have to talk about this, Tobias, about all these, unexpected discoveries. Of course we will, he answered dryly. At home. They headed for the exit. I watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Bitterness, disappointment, but also some relief. At least the truth had finally been revealed, as painful as it had been. When the door closed behind them, Rosalind sighed. I'm so sorry, Mr. Fulton. This, not quite the family dinner we'd hoped for. I smiled weakly. Please call me Hubert, and don't apologize. It's not your fault. Nor yours, I suppose, Edmund said. Family relationships can be difficult, especially after a divorce. My first wife, Pearl's mother, and I went through it too. You're divorced? I asked, surprised by this revelation. He nodded. More than 20 years. Rosalind and I married when Pearl was 12. There were difficult moments, especially in our teens. Pearl blamed me for everything at one time too. But over time, she realized that divorce is rarely one person's fault, Rosalind added, and that parents are still parents, even if they're no longer together. I felt the tension that had been gripping me all evening begin to release. These people understood the situation much better than I had realized. Thank you for understanding, I said sincerely. Admittedly, I hadn't expected the evening to end in such a civilized. Edmund laughed. Well, it's not over yet. I see you have a fine wine list. Perhaps you could recommend something special for dessert? The next hour passed in a surprisingly pleasant conversation. We talked about the restaurant business, the hotel industry, travel, wine. Edmund proved to be a knowledgeable conversationalist and a real connoisseur of good food. Rosalind, more reserved at first, gradually joined the conversation too, talking about the charitable projects she was involved in. I ordered a special dessert for us, a pear baked with blue cheese and walnuts, covered with honey sauce. It was accompanied by a glass of sauterne, a sweet French wine with notes of apricot and honey. Delicious. Rosalind closed her eyes, savoring the dessert. Just delicious. I agree, Edmund nodded. Hubert, I wasn't kidding about the partnership. I do have a few hotels that lack a good restaurant. If you're interested in expanding your business, we could discuss the possibilities. I was surprised by this offer. That's very interesting, Edmund. But won't it cause problems with Tobias? He's obviously not thrilled with me. Edmund shook his head. Business is business. And as for Tobias, give him time to cool off. He had a shock today. He found out that his father was not the man he thought he was, or perhaps the man he wanted others to think he was. He's got a lot of rethinking to do. And Pearl will help him, Rosalind added. She is a sensible girl, in spite of her young age, and she has a great appreciation of family, the whole family. She seems a fine young woman, I said. Tobias has made a good choice. We think so too, Rosalind smiled. And you know what? I think that deep down Tobias is proud of you. It's just hard for him to admit it, especially after all these years of creating a very different image of himself. I wanted to believe it, but I doubted it. The anger in Tobias's eyes, his harsh words, everything said that reconciliation, if it was possible at all, would be a long and difficult process. When the dessert was finished and the bill was paid, despite my protests, Edmund insisted on paying, we went outside. The night was cool but clear, the stars shining brightly in the dark sky. Thank you for a lovely evening, in spite of circumstances, Edmund said, shaking my hand. I'll be in touch about that business proposition. I'll be waiting, I nodded. And thank you for your understanding and diplomacy. Life has taught me that, he smiled. By the way, here's my business card. It has my personal phone number. Rosalind shook my hand warmly. It was very nice to meet you, Hubert. I hope we'll see each other again. I hope so too, I replied sincerely. When they left, I stood outside the restaurant for a long time, looking up at the starry sky. This evening was not what I had expected. I had planned a little revenge, and what I got was, what? A new beginning? Or a final breakup with my son? Time would tell. But one thing I knew for sure, I would no longer live out other people's ideas of me. Not my son's, not anyone else's. I was Hubert Fulton, owner of the North Star, a man who had built a new life from the rubble of an old one. And I was proud of that, even if my own son couldn't or wouldn't share that pride. 3 days had passed since that memorable evening, and I hadn't heard from Tobias. I tried calling him twice, but both times the call went to voicemail. I hadn't left a message. What could I say? I'm sorry for ruining the loser father image you created. I'm sorry I turned out to be a successful businessman instead of a miserable drunk. On Monday, I worked at the restaurant since early morning, checking grocery deliveries and discussing new dishes for the fall menu with the chef. Work has always been my salvation, a way to not think about personal problems. But this time, even the usual worries couldn't distract me from thinking about my son. Every time the front door opened, I involuntarily looked up, hoping to see Tobias. It was silly. Why would he come back here after such a humiliation? But part of me still hoped he'd come, that we'd finally have a real conversation. Instead, there was a message from Edmund Addington, a short, business-like message, asking me to meet next week to discuss a possible partnership. I replied in the affirmative, though my thoughts were not at all on business. On Tuesday, I tried calling Tobias again, and again without success. It was beginning to resemble our usual relationship. I call, he ignores. Only now it was different. He now knew the truth about me, and that only seemed to increase his desire to stay away. On Wednesday, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when the restaurant had already closed after the lunch hour and was preparing for the evening shift, Vincent informed me that someone wanted to see me. A young woman, he said, peering into my office. She says she's your sister-in-law. I froze, not believing my ears. Pearl? Here? Alone? Sokonom. Take her into the small hall, I said, quickly tidying up. and bring her tea or coffee, whichever she prefers. The small room was in a separate wing of the restaurant, used for private functions. It was empty now, the perfect place for a conversation that I sensed would be difficult. Pearl was sitting at a table by the window, looking out onto a small patio with a fountain. She was wearing a simple beige dress and minimal jewelry, just her wedding ring and small pearl earrings. She looked tired and a little stressed. Pearl, I smiled as I entered the hall. What a nice surprise. She stood up and held out her hand. Mr. Fulton, thank you for seeing me. I know I came unannounced. Please call me Hubert. I shook her hand. Huh, and you need no warning. You're always welcome here. We sat down and Vincent appeared with a tray with a teapot and 2 cups. I ordered tea for both of us, Pearl said. I hope you don't mind. Good idea, I nodded, pouring the flavored drink into the cups. How did you find your way here? Is Tobias with you? She shook her head. No, he doesn't know I'm here. He would disapprove. I nodded understandingly. Is he still angry? Angry, she sighed. Hurt, embarrassed. All of the above. I understand, I answered quietly. That night was unexpected for everyone, especially for him. Pearl took a sip of her tea. Tobias has always been a very proud man. It was very important to him what others thought of him. And what happened on Friday, it was humiliating, I finished for her. I know, and part of me regrets it. But only part. She looked up at me with scrutinizing eyes. Why did you do that? Why didn't you just call him beforehand? Tell him it was your restaurant. I thought for a moment, searching for the words. It was an important question, and I had to answer honestly. I was originally going to do that, I began. But then I heard him telling you and your parents about me. That story about the poor, failing father with the alcohol problem. I shook my head. It was too much. Not just a lie, but betrayal. He'd used me as part of his made-up success story, and I felt an anger I hadn't felt in a long time. Pearl lowered her eyes. He didn't just tell that story that night. He's been telling it for years to everyone who knows him. I clenched my jaw, feeling a wave of bitterness rise up inside me again. Is that so? Yeah, she twirled her wedding ring nervously. When we first met, he'd told me that his father was an accountant who'd gotten lost after the divorce, started drinking, barely making ends meet. He said he regularly sends you money to help. I couldn't believe my ears. He said he was helping me financially? Pearl nodded. Yes. He even showed me the receipts for the transfers. She hesitated, as if realizing something. I now think they were fake. Of course they were fake, I grinned bitterly. I never got a dime from him. Didn't need it. I'm beginning to understand, she lowered her head. You know, in his story, you were the centerpiece. He told me how hard it was growing up with a father who took no interest in him. How after the divorce you sank and became a burden. How he swore to himself never to be like you and did everything he could to succeed on his own without anyone else's help. Every word hit like a hammer. I envisioned my son telling this story over and over again to his wife, her family, co-workers, friends, creating the image of a hero who overcame a difficult childhood and an unreliable father to become successful. He even cried the first time he told me about it. Pearl continued, her voice trembling. I remember holding his hand and thinking how strong and honorable he was, that he still cared for you in spite of it all. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to deal with the rush of emotions. Anger, resentment, disappointment, all mixed into a tight lump in my chest. And you believed him, I said finally. Everyone did. Yes, she looked genuinely remorseful. Why would he lie about something like that? It seemed like such a personal, painful story, not the kind you make up. I sighed. I understand, and I don't blame you or your parents. Tobias was always convincing when he wanted to be. Pearl looked me straight in the eye. After that night at the restaurant, I started to piece together the facts, remembering the oddities, the inconsistencies in his stories. For example, he never showed me pictures of you, saying he tore up everything after the divorce. He never told specific stories from his childhood, only general phrases about hard times, and those supposedly regular calls to you, after which he always looked upset. Which never happened, I finished for her. She nodded. Yes, I asked him about it after the restaurant. Demanded the truth. And do you know what he said? I shook my head. He said, who cares? The story worked. Pearl said it quietly, but there was such disappointment in her voice that I felt sorry for her. It was working, like it was just uh, a marketing ploy, a way to elicit sympathy, to look more impressive. I didn't know what to say. My son, who I'd once held in my arms, taught to ride a bike, sent off to college, had turned me into a tool to promote his own image, used a fictionalized version of my life to build a reputation for himself. I'm ashamed of him, Pearl said after a pause, and for myself too, for not seeing the obvious inconsistencies, for not asking questions. I should have known something was wrong when he refused to invite you to our wedding. Don't blame yourself, I touched her arm gently. We trust the ones we love. It's natural. She smiled weakly. Thank you, but that doesn't change the fact that I was blind. Neither did my parents. Although, she hesitated, I think my dad had his suspicions. He offered to meet you several times, but Tobias always made excuses. Your father seems like a shrewd man, I said. He is, Pearl nodded. And you know he's very impressed with you, your history, your restaurant. He called me yesterday, said he wanted to offer you a business partnership. Yes, he's already contacted me, I smiled. We agreed to meet next week. Pearl was silent, twirling her cup in her hands. Tobias will be furious if he finds out. He sees it as a betrayal. Betrayal of what? That his father-in-law wants to do business with a man who owns a successful restaurant? I couldn't resist a little sarcasm. That his father-in-law chooses you over him. She shook her head. You have no idea how important my father's approval is to him. He sees Papa as a figure to be conformed to prove his worth. And now that Dad's interested in you, it hurts his ego, I finished, beginning to understand. Tobias had always been ambitious, always wanted to be the best, to get all the awards, all the accolades. But I never thought that this trait would turn into this. Pearl looked out the window at the jets of the fountain glistening in the afternoon sunlight. You know what the saddest part is? He's a really talented man. Smart, hardworking, great business sense. He didn't need to make up a story about overcoming a difficult childhood to impress people. His real accomplishments spoke for themselves. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Yes, he's always been capable. Even in high school, his teachers recognized his potential. I remember how proud I was of his first successes, of him going to university. Did you help him with his studies? Pearl asked. Of course I did. Paid for college, helped with housing. That was before the divorce, but even afterward, I kept sending money for his education. His mother couldn't afford it on her own, despite her new husband's support. Pearl looked shocked. He never said anything about it. On the contrary, he claimed that he paid for his education by working several jobs at the same time. I felt the bitterness rising inside me again. That's not true. He had a part-time job in the summer, but it was barely enough to cover his expenses. I paid all the bills. We were silent, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. I tried to make sense of what I'd learned. Tobias wasn't just ashamed of me or distant because of the divorce. He'd built his new life, his image, on lies about me, on a made-up story of getting over. Why did you come here today, Pearl? I finally asked. What do you want? She folded her hands on the table, gathering her thoughts. First, I wanted to apologize. For myself, for Tobias, for the way things turned out. You didn't deserve to have your life twisted like that. Thank you, I nodded. It means a lot. And also, she hesitated. I'd like to know the real story. About you, about Tobias, about your family. I think I have a right to know what I really married into. It was a fair request, and I began to tell. About my marriage to Varen, about the birth of Tobias, about the years when we were a family. Not perfect, but real. About my job as an accountant, which provided stability but no fulfillment. About how Varen and I had drifted apart until we were almost strangers, living under the same roof. About her decision to leave for another man. About the divorce. About Tobias choosing his mother's side. I talked about the emptiness and despair I felt after they left. About the decision to change my life. About cooking classes. About my first steps in the restaurant business. About the hardships. The mistakes, the near bankruptcies, and finally the success of North Star. All this time I tried to keep in touch with Tobias, I said, finishing my story. I called, wrote, tried to meet him, but he was always busy or not in the mood. After a few years of these attempts, I started calling less often. And when he moved and changed his number without telling me the new one, I realized he didn't want me in his life. Pearl listened attentively, not interrupting. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, as if digesting what I'd heard. "It's a different story from the one I knew," she said at last. "Different than the one everyone who talks to Tobias knows." I shrugged. "It's a true story. Not heroic, not dramatic, just life with all its ups and downs." "What do we do now?" she asked, and there was uncertainty in her voice. "I don't know how to live with someone who lied so long and convincingly about something so important." I sighed. "That's for you to decide, Pearl. I can't give you advice about your marriage. All I can say is that Tobias, despite all this, remains my son, and I think that deep down he is a good man who has lost his way somewhere." She smiled wryly. "Off track is a good definition. He's so entangled in his lies that I think he's starting to believe them himself." "It happens," I nodded. "Sometimes a lie we repeat long enough becomes the truth." Pearl finished her tea and put the cup back on the saucer. "I have to go. Tobias will be looking for me if I'm late." "Will you tell him you were here?" I asked. She paused, thinking, "Not today, but soon, yes. We have much to discuss." All of this, she put her hand around, referring not only to the restaurant, but to the whole situation, cannot go without repercussions. I walked her to the door, feeling strangely relieved by our conversation. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually being listened to, that my side of the story mattered. "Thank you for coming, Pearl," I said, shaking her hand, "and thank you for listening." She hugged me in surprise. "No, thank you. For being honest. For not hating Tobias, despite everything he'd done. For accepting me today." I hugged her back, tears welling up in my eyes. In that moment, she seemed more than just my son's wife, but a member of the family I hadn't had in so long. "Take care of yourself," I said when she pulled away. "And know that you're always welcome here, no matter how things turn out between Tobias and me." She nodded and walked out, leaving me with a lot of thoughts and feelings to process. Back in the small hall, I sat at the window for a long time, looking at the fountain and thinking about our conversation. I understood now why Tobias had been so distant, why he had been reluctant to introduce me to his new family. Not because he was ashamed of my humble position, as I'd originally assumed. It was because I could ruin his carefully constructed image, his story of how he'd overcome a difficult childhood with a loser father. All these years he'd used me, or rather a fictionalized version of me, as part of his legend. The story of how he made it on his own, without anyone else's help. How he'd risen from dirt to princes by overcoming a difficult childhood. The irony was that the reality was much more prosaic. Ordinary family, ordinary divorce, ordinary problems. No great drama, no heroic overcoming, just everyday life with its joys and sorrows. But Tobias decided to rewrite the story, to create a narrative in which he was the hero and I was the obstacle to overcome. And he told the story so convincingly that everyone around him, his wife, her family, co-workers, friends, believed it. And now the truth was out, and Tobias had to face the consequences of his lies. I didn't know if he'd have the courage to admit his mistake, to apologize, to start over. I didn't know if we could ever regain any semblance of a normal relationship. But I knew one thing for sure. I would no longer be a part of his made-up story. I wouldn't be the loser dad that made him look like a hero. It was time for the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. It's been almost 4 months since that memorable evening at the North Star. Winter came to West Fargo early, covering the town in a white blanket of snow back in mid-November. I love this time of year. The quiet of snow-covered streets, the coziness of a warm restaurant where people come to warm up from the cold. But this time, the winter calm didn't bring me the usual peacefulness. All this time, I couldn't stop thinking about Tobias, about our last meeting, about that conversation with Pearl. I'd tried to contact my son several times, but he hadn't returned my calls or messages. The only source of news about him was Pearl, who occasionally stopped by the restaurant or called. From her, I learned that Tobias had immersed himself in his work, trying not to talk about what had happened. When she tried to bring it up, he either changed the subject or left the house on the pretext of urgent business. Only once, after a particularly persistent questioning, he exploded. "You don't understand," he shouted. "He destroyed everything I'd spent years building. My reputation, my position. People look at me differently, no longer with respect, but with pity, or worse, with derision." Poor Tobias, who made up a story about a loser father, and it turned out that Daddy was a successful restaurateur. I understood his anger. Tobias had always been proud, even as a child. It was unbearable for him to feel like a fraud whose lies had been exposed. But I couldn't forgive him for the story he'd made up about me. I couldn't forget how he had used a fictionalized version of my life to build a reputation for himself as a man who had risen from the dirt to the dukes. As time went on, our estrangement only intensified. I'd been used to living without my son for years, but now, after learning the truth about his attitude toward me, I felt a new pain, the pain of betrayal that was different from simple sadness for a lost relationship. In late November, I met with Edmund Addington. We spent the whole day discussing his proposal for a partnership. He wanted me to open a branch of the North Star in one of his boutique hotels in Madison, Wisconsin. It was an enticing project, a new city, new opportunities, a new page in my life. "You won't regret it, Hubert," Edmund said, showing pictures of the hotel, an elegant colonial-style building with ample room for a restaurant. "The Madison House is one of the best hotels in town, but it lacks a good restaurant. Your concept would fit in perfectly." I looked at the photos, listened to his plans, studied the numbers, and felt interest slowly ignite inside. I'd turned down several offers to expand my business over the years, preferring to focus on my one and only restaurant in West Fargo. But now something was different. Perhaps it had to do with recent events, with the realization that my life here was largely defined by the hope of someday reconnecting with my son, a hope that now seemed more elusive than ever. "I'll think about it," I said to Edmund at the end of the meeting. "This is a big decision. I need time." He nodded understandingly. "Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come along every day." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the snow-covered city outside the window. West Fargo had been my home for most of my life. I was born here, raised here, married here, raised my son here. It's also where I went through a divorce, started over, built a successful business. Leaving here meant leaving behind not only a place, but an important part of myself. On the other hand, what was keeping me here now? The North Star could run without my day-to-day involvement. I had a great team that I trusted. I didn't have many friends, and it was possible to keep in touch with them from a distance. And Tobias? He'd made it clear he didn't want me in his life. Maybe the distance between us would be good for both of us. In early December, an event occurred that shook me to the core. Pearl came into the restaurant, and I could tell by the look on her face that she brought important news. "Hubert," she said, sitting down opposite me in the familiar small room, "I have some news." We?" She took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant. You're about to become a grandfather." I froze, unable to believe my ears. A grandfather? Me? It seemed so unreal, so unexpected. It's wonderful," I finally squeezed out, tears welling up in my eyes. "When?" "June," she smiled. "The doctor says it's going well." "And Tobias? Is he happy?" Her smile became a little strained. "Yes, he's happy. He's always wanted children. But what?" She hesitated, searching for words. "He doesn't want you to be involved in the child's life. At least not yet. He said he needed time to forgive you." I felt something inside me snap. Not to see your grandson or granddaughter? Not to hold in his arms, not to see his first steps, not to hear his first words? "Forgive me," I grinned bitterly. "For what? Because I didn't fit the image of a loser he'd created?" Pearl shook her head. "He sees it differently. He thinks you deliberately humiliated him in front of my family, that you could have warned him in advance about the restaurant. But you chose public exposure. I didn't argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe I really could have done things differently. But then that night, when I heard my son telling his new family about me as a pathetic drunk, I didn't think about the consequences. I just wanted to restore the truth. I'm sorry about what happened, I said finally. What he, but I can't change the past. And I can't make Tobias forgive me if he's not ready. Pearl took my hand. I know, and believe me, I'm on your side. I'm trying to convince him that a child should know his grandfather. That family isn't just the people we have a perfect relationship with. I squeezed her hand in return, grateful for those words. Thank you, Pearl. That means a lot to me. Congratulations. You're going to be a great mom. After she left, I sat in my office for a long time, digesting the news. A grandson or a granddaughter, a new life, a new family member who may never know me. It was a bitter pill. That night, I made a decision. I called Edmund Addington and told him I was accepting his offer. I would go to Madison and open a branch of the North Star. I would start a new chapter of my life in a new city, among new people. The next few weeks were busy. I prepared the restaurant for my extended absence, appointed Raymond as temporary manager, discussed with my lawyer the legal details of my partnership with Addington. I sold my apartment and found a small house in Madison, not far from the hotel where the new restaurant was to open. All this time, I couldn't stop thinking about Tobias, about his future child, about the fact that I was leaving without even saying goodbye to my son. A few times I wanted to call him, but each time I put the phone off. What could I say? What words could undo what had happened between us? On the last day before I left, I decided to write a letter. The old-fashioned way, but for some reason it felt right. I sat down at the desk in my empty office and took out pen and paper. Dear Tobias, I began, and the two words already seemed awkward, out of place. When was the last time we were truly dear to each other? But I continued writing, letting the words flow freely, not thinking too much about each phrase. By the time you read this letter, I will already be in Madison. I have accepted Edmund Addington's offer to open a branch of the North Star in one of his hotels. It's a new start for me, a new chapter of life. I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, about that evening in the restaurant, the lies you told about me for years, the anger and resentment we both feel. I won't say I understand your motives, I don't. I won't say I forgive, I don't know if I can ever fully forgive. But I want you to know that despite all of this, I love you. You are my son, and nothing will change that. I learned from Pearl that I'm going to be a grandfather soon. This news made me both happy and sad at the same time. Happy because a new life is always a miracle. Sad because I may never get to meet this child, see him grow up, or hear him call me grandpa. I'm not leaving because I'm giving up or running away from my problems. I'm leaving because sometimes distance is the only way to give both parties space to heal. You and I are both stubborn, both proud, both unable to admit our mistakes. Perhaps time and distance will help us see things in a different light. I'm leaving you in charge of the North Star in West Fargo. The legal documents are ready and waiting for your signature from my attorney. The restaurant will stay in the family, even if you and I are never a family in the full sense of the word again. I'm not asking you to forgive me or understand me. I'm not asking you to repair the relationship or let me be a part of your child's life. I just want you to know that the door will always be open. If ever you decide you're ready to talk, I'll be waiting. Love, your father, Hubert. I reread the letter several times, wondering if it was too sentimental, too frank. But then I decided to leave it as it was. After all, these were my real feelings, unadorned and unadorned. I sealed the letter in an envelope and asked Pearl to give it to Tobias after I left. She promised to do so and wished me luck in my new place. I'll keep you posted about the baby, she said, hugging me goodbye. And who knows, maybe one day we'll all be able to gather around the same table. I smiled, but inside I felt it was unlikely. Tobias had inherited my stubbornness, and if he was determined to cut me out of his life, he wasn't likely to change his mind anytime soon. My last day in West Fargo was snowy and cold. I walked the familiar streets, said goodbye to neighbors and friends, and visited places that were dear to me one last time. In the evening, I hosted a farewell dinner for the staff of the North Star, people who had become my second family over the years. Raymond made a toast in my honor, and I saw tears in the eyes of some of the staff. They gave me gifts, wished me luck, promised to come to Madison when the new restaurant opened. This is not goodbye, I told them. It's just a new chapter for all of us. But deep down, I knew it was really goodbye for me. To the city, to the restaurant, to the life I've built here. And perhaps with the hope of someday reconnecting with my son. In the morning, I packed the last of my things and hailed a cab to the airport. Before leaving, I looked around the apartment one more time, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. On the table was a letter for Tobias, which I was supposed to give to Pearl. I took the envelope and thought for a moment. Should I have left those words unspoken? Would Tobias not even read the letter? Throw it away without opening it? Or would he read it and get even angrier? But then I remembered that he would soon be a father. And one day perhaps he'll understand my feelings. He'll understand what it means to love a child in spite of disagreements and resentment. Will understand what it means to be willing to forgive, even when forgiveness is not accepted. I put the letter in my pocket and walked out of the apartment, closing the door behind me. A new life awaited me in Madison, a new restaurant, new opportunities, new acquaintances. I didn't know if I would find happiness there, but I was willing to try. The cab was already waiting downstairs. The driver helped me load my suitcases and asked, "To the airport, sir?" "Yes," I answered, taking one last look at the house that had been mine for the past 15 years. "To the airport. I have a flight at 10. We pulled out of the car, and I looked out the window at the snow-covered West Fargo floating by. The town was waking up. People were rushing to work. Kids were rushing to school. Stores were opening their doors. Just an ordinary winter day, one of many I've spent here, and the first of many I would spend away. In my pocket was a letter for my son, my thoughts, feelings, hopes, regrets, packed into a few hundred words. I didn't know if he would read it. I didn't know if it would change anything between us. But I didn't just write it for Tobias. I wrote it for me too. To close one chapter of my life and start another. To say what I had to say, even if no one would hear. The cab pulled onto the highway and West Fargo was behind us. Ahead was Madison, a new restaurant, new opportunities. A new life at 73. A lot of people would call it crazy, but I felt strangely calm. I'd started from scratch once before, after a divorce, and then it turned out to be the best decision of my life. Who knows, maybe this fresh start would bring something good too. I closed my eyes thinking about the future, about the restaurant that would open in the spring, about a grandson or granddaughter who will be born in the summer, perhaps never recognizing their grandfather, about a son who, somewhere far behind, is reading or not reading my letter. Life went on with all its twists and turns, disappointments, and unexpected joys. And I was ready for the next chapter, whatever it turned out to be.